Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the AGI Heads and Chairs webinar this month. My name is Leila Gonzalez from AGI, and joining us today is Pranoti Asher, who's Assistant Director of Grants and Education Programs at AGU, and Christopher Keene, who is the Director of Geoscience Profession and Higher Education here at AGI. Also joining us is Delaney Robinson from AGI, and she and I will be running some of the background technical support for today's webinar. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Pranoti to get us started.
All right, thank you, Leila. Welcome, everybody. It's good to see so many of you joining us this Friday afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. We're very excited to learn about the recent graduate surveys, looking at all the trends that AGI and others working with Chris have been working on for a while. Chris is, as you can see, he's the Director of Geoscience Profession and Higher Education at AGI, and he has been at AGI for almost 25 years. He is going to share some of the recent work, and we're looking forward to learning about what he and his team have understood from this last batch of surveys, and we're looking forward to having conversations and asking lots of questions. So take it away, Chris.
Thank you, Pranoti. So yeah, this is a lovely opportunity to expand on some of the discussion that we held in November, looking at the recent graduate survey. We've had a chance to expand the data that we've analyzed, cleaned it up, and been able to do a bit more of an analysis on the factors that are playing in. The good news is we're in sort of final galleys for the actual survey, so be looking for announcements here. I would really hope within the next week for the actual final survey. So today is sort of a sampling buffet of some of the data that's presented. It's probably about a third of the various areas of analysis that are presented. So just to give you a sense of some of the bigger trends. So the exit survey for 2020-21. We canvassed the December, May, and August graduates of that academic year. Obviously, the vast majority were December and May. And it was strictly focused on U.S. geoscience degree recipients. And just as a caveat, just for abbreviation, when we say BS for bachelors, that is inclusive of Bachelors of Arts. Same thing with the masters. When we say MS, it's also inclusive Masters of Arts. Just to make efficient in the various in the various charts. So the first thing we'll want to do is take a look at what the demographics of our group look like. So we had approximately 11% of the graduates from last year respond to the survey. We're not claiming any specific statistical power, but some of the other independent factors, it is informative of some of the things that are happening. So the first one is sort of looking at what our degree level responses were. So a little over half of the responses, were from bachelor's recipients, and the rest was split between PhD and masters. The survey responses are slightly oversampled for bachelors as a total number, but not too bad. This actually works out pretty well. When we look at sort of the age of the individual when they've received their degree, the biggest thing I just really want to point out as a fundamental trend change that we've had is our PhD recipients are getting a little bit younger. Geoscience has traditionally had the oldest average age at award of a doctorate at about 33.5, 34 years old. That has now drifted down to about 32, but we've had a increasing mode down in the late 20s. So one of the key things that we're seeing is we don't have our graduates going out and working for a couple years and then going back to school, which was one of those big drivers that we had for several decades actually. So this is a fundamental change. When we ask folks about their gender identity, I think this is actually really interesting in the sense that almost 60% of our bachelor's recipients of respondents were women, and even a bigger proportion at the master's level. And when we look at the enrollments, this we have basically been seeing complete parity by gender in enrollments for the last several years. In fact, the PhD has tended to actually be slightly higher than 50% female. So it's a little odd that we have more men responding. So there's some artifacts, I think, in the responses, but I also think there's a very big question, as we have seen, as I'm sure all of you are well aware, the rapid decline of male participation on, particularly in undergraduate programs, now down to only 40% of all undergraduates. How much of that is actually at the incoming freshman point versus attrition during the course of studies? And and obviously this is a cohort that was impacted the pandemic, so this will be a factor that we're going to keep an eye on for the next couple years. So when we look at the race of our respondents, we all know we're terrible on this, and the reality is we're 90% white across pretty much all of the sectors. And where we are seeing that growth is actually in multiracial, and this is actually a phenomenon across the across all components of U.S. society versus any very specific racial category. So it's a complex subject, but we have a long ways to go. And I think when we look at the demographics of students, we clearly have an attrition problem, and that's something that we'll have to look at. So this is probably the one single data point that concerns me the most from this year's survey. We asked folks, regarding their Hispanic heritage, and we have been growing very healthily with that engagement of that community. And in prior years, we were 17, 18, 19% of our bachelor's recipients reported Hispanic heritage, and now we see it collapse to about 3%. Initial reaction is we had some kind of a wacko sampling problem, but there have been some other pieces of data that have come in that are independent that have actually shown it looks like we did see a substantial decrease in the rate of graduation for Hispanics in geoscience last year. I think we have to probably point to impacts from the pandemic, and I think this raises some very big concerns for us. Has our community failed this particular population, that we're potentially facing some very specific situations, and we weren't able to accommodate. It's a terrifying thought to me that we potentially had this kind of attrition of folks that were pretty much ready to finish their degree, and we will be keeping a close eye on this and see what happens in this next year, see if it recovers, or have we had some kind of other systemic change. So when we look at the field of degree for the bachelors, this is basically what they've indicated, what they majored in, what their primary area of study was. Across the geoscience programs, a little over half come in at geology, and there's this big chunk on earth science. And earth science is the term, and the framing is growing in popularity, both as a degree descriptor, as well as in the vernacular, and it's something for us to be thinking about. What I do find interesting is that the environmental science as a degree is just only slightly over 11% of our degrees awarded. We've seen a lot of departments start offering programs in that, and I would be very interested to understand from everyone in the audience during the Q&A. Are you not seeing folks actually completing those degrees? Are they shifting, into other majors or into geology? Or, it's interesting to see that we've had this multi-decade investment in adding those program areas, but they're not necessarily showing up in the data. And there's a sort of a dribble of other areas because most things really do fall under the major categories at the bachelor's level. When we kick over to masters, it doesn't change that much actually, which is interesting. You do see a few areas in atmospheric science, some of the oceanography start to pop up, and in particular, not too surprising, the GIS and tech. If we had a lot of the pure play geography departments in here, that would obviously blow up even more. But within our geoscience related community, That would be programs that also are inclusive of physical geography. They're there at the master's level, but not overwhelming. And it's at the doctorate, obviously, where you really see folks specialize. Geology shrinks down to about a quarter. You do see geophysics and geochemistry really become the the big dogs here. And again, earth science continues to hang out at a pretty substantial level, which I find interesting from a vernacular standpoint. You do see things like atmospheric sciences and the oceanography. The very specialty areas really do start popping out much more. In the final report, we have a Sankey diagram that actually shows the degree progression of folks. And you can sort of see how people move from some of the core traditional fields like geology and chemistry and physics, and they start moving into these more diverse fields as they move along in their degrees. So, citizenship status, this is obviously a big issue when you talk about enrollments. A lot of international students are full fee paying, which is very attractive to the universities, and certainly in STEM have been important, though it has been depressed over the last several years. Things such as, some of the administration policies, the Trump administration policies, some of the stress we've had, politically with China, and obviously the pandemic has played a role. When we look at the different degree levels, our international student body is just not that dominant at the bachelor's and master's level. There is some, but we are not really actually a big attractor as a discipline for that. At the doctoral level, we're looking at about 16% on student visas that are coming in. This is a little higher than it has been for us in the last couple of years. It's been in closer to 10%, but we are still below STEM, which I believe this last year was 23%, which is down from some substantially higher numbers last decade. So we do have an international flavor, but I think all these external factors do continue to have a play. Okay, so one of the other big things that folks talk about is how and when are the students getting interested in geoscience? So we ask, by degree level, did you take an earth science class in high school? And it's really interesting to see the master's is the area that's the strongest, with over half of them reporting having taken an earth science. And we see this in a few other areas that, this is hard to project that doing earth science in high school increases the recruitment, but it certainly definitely seems to impact persistence, particularly given recognizing the master's is the degree employment in geoscience. It's sort of looking at folks that discovered it and were pretty heavily committed the whole way through. So it is an interesting factor to look at. And then we also ask, when did you decide, and to pursue a geoscience degree? And when you look at this, you're looking at about a third were pre-college, or maybe if they were at a community college, making that decision at that point. And then obviously the freshman experience takes us well over 60%. But again, the master's, there's this really front-loaded commitment towards pursuing a geoscience degree, which I do find very, very interesting. Not too surprising with the PhD. One of the things, the Sankey diagram in the final report that you'll be able to see, we draw in a very diverse set of backgrounds into our PhD programs in geoscience. So we do have a lot of dynamics that make our PhD graduates, rather unique. And one of those is they tended to obviously commit to geoscience at a later time. Okay, so some of the educational experiences. So one of the things we did is we took the recommendations in the Vision and Change document regarding concepts and skills, and asked the students about what their exposure levels were to these various skills in their most recent pursuit of degree. And basically, the more blue it is, the stronger, the more persistent their exposure to these concepts were. I personally find interesting, being a sort of traditional geology background, that deep time seemed to be a particular area that folks did not necessarily have a ton of exposure to across almost all the degree levels. And then you see in the doctoral level, the people are very focused on their areas and did not necessarily come through traditional geoscience programs. So some of their breadth of their exposure is not as strong as, say at the master's level. When we get to actual geoscience skills, things such as, dealing with uncertainty and applying GIS to geologic problems and integrating data, things like that. Again, you see the increase in the skillfulness by degree level. There's nothing surprising about that. One of the things I find particularly interesting, is the GIS skills. We'll see this as a technical skill later. Basically, students have been introduced to it as a tool, but this is about their application in their geoscience work, and there's been exposure, but there's not a lot of use, particularly at the bachelor's level, and it improves a little bit at the master's. So when we look at general science skills, again mapping to the vision and change, it is interesting that we see sort of some weakness in the areas of interdisciplinary teams and working across cultures. And that's sort of somewhat persistent across all of the degree levels. Communicating with the public is another one. It's hard to judge, I think, whether this is a systemic issue, or because I think all of these are components that would be negatively impacted by the pandemic and having to move to remote learning and some of the other dynamics that we saw impacted. So we're very interested to see how this moves forward, particularly since these are identified science skills that the employers are particularly interested in seeing in their new hires. And so this is when we look at specific computational data skills. We're not a hotbed in the geosciences, for sort of universal depth on this. But I wanted to point out the interesting area that the GIS, like for the undergraduates, there's actually a fair bit of exposure to that as a tool, but we're not seeing it used in actual geoscience problems. So, my best inference at this point is the students are getting introduced, they're making some maps, but they're not actually necessarily doing analytics with it. So, as a tool set, there's some opportunities to grow there, but you definitely see by degree level, especially at the doctoral level, the skillfulness of the graduates has gone way up across a whole slew of these areas. And we think this is driving some of the employment changes we're seeing. We've been tracking this. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen this this chart ad nausea, and we keep updating it. Basically, what are the math courses that the students have taken through their academic career? It is interesting to most get through Calc 1 or Calc 2. We still see the same phenomenon that the undergraduates that take advanced math, they tend to take all of them. So there's a cohort. They're almost all at R1 institutions. There seems to be a specific profile that leads to that. What I do find interesting, and it's been pointed out, is we still are very weak on our classical statistics, and we continue to see regression on that by our doctoral recipients, now below 60%. When I present this to colleagues in other fields, they pretty much all fall off their chair. Can't believe that we have doctoral graduates that have never taken any kind of a statistics course coming through. In the final report, we do analyze the taking of statistics by field of study, and those are some very interesting results. There is some really high dependency on the field of study and whether or not folks have taken stats. Straight geology actually is the weakest. I think it was only about 30% of them ever took an actual stats course, and we have a whole number of fields of study where everyone does. So something for us to consider in those graduate curricula and how we're addressing some of these issues. So just looking at complementary sciences, most people take chemistry and most take physics. It's interesting to still see we have about a 60-40 split on doing just algebra-based physics versus calculus-based physics. Again, I think this is sort of reflective of some challenges in the quantitative skill level of a lot of our students. I think there's great opening. I know biology and I know physics have made major inroads in having custom math courses covering a lot of these topics in context. And I still think this is an area that we probably need to look at to help our students, boost up their comfort levels. I don't think it's a lack of ability. I think it's a comfort level of being pushed through some of the traditional math programs. Field courses. This is, so these would be your traditional, dedicated course on field work, field methods, field camp, and we have a criteria of a certain number of weeks of field work within a course. Not too surprising, it's been at this level, about 80% have taken at least one in our bachelor's and master's. It's been like that for years. And the doctorate, again, we have this very diverse population coming into our doctoral programs. And so we do have a substantial number that have never done any field work. So it's certainly an interesting phenomenon. Sort of the other side, though, is internships. This is, have you held an internship during your programs? And it's pretty steady. I think most do these within their undergraduate experience. We don't see a lot of pickup of like the NSF supplement for internship placements, for instance. I think that's an untapped resource that would be outstanding to see geoscience really expand on. But again, it's about a 60-40 split, and something that is a challenge. One thing I can say is when we look at success rates for students, you either have students pretty much get an offer for every internship that they apply to, or they get none. And I think this comes down to, as I've heard from many colleagues, in the departments, their top students are really, really good. And then there's a lot that are struggling. And I think we see that. And as a community, ideally, we want to help those students that maybe, aren't the popping up in the academic program as the greatest shining star. Some of these other experiences could really accelerate their achievement. So, we asked about the number of research experiences, and one of the things we wanted to tap was there an impact from REUs? And as best we can look, sure, the students that had an REU basically were very research intensive during the course of their undergraduate experience. And I think, obviously the 1 and 2s of non-REU students, a lot of those are senior thesis, capstone courses, things like that. But I do think it is rather telling, and it would be interesting for us to dig deeper to look at the impact of those highly structured and intensive research experiences early on in undergraduate and how that catalyzes that kind of activity. Looking at research methods, this has remained steady. We were curious with the pandemic. Obviously the breadth and depth of use of different research methods goes up by degree level. This is pretty consistent to what we have seen over the years. No big changes. Within that, no real surprises. This, I think, is a really important one. There's some very obvious components that we all recognize about sources of financial support that the individual students are making their own investments, but the families and debt are key components for the bachelors in funding their studies, whereas the teaching and research assistantships and departmental scholarships are really critical for the grad students. I think two that I look at that are opportunity spaces. One, we only have 22% of our bachelors having work study. This is indicative that most undergraduates in geoscience come from fairly wealthy families. There's not necessarily a ton of financial aid going towards them. So that's one predictor. But I think the other big one is the fact that out of all of our graduates that responded, we only had one person who was on a GI Bill or ROTC scholarship. When you have 77,000 undergraduates in the United States a year that are attending on a GI Bill or ROTC scholarship, we're obviously not tapping that population. And my understanding is those students are recognized as full fare paying, cash paying students to the university. So they're certainly considered valuable, and probably an area that we can, as a community, need to think about tapping. So quick look at some of the next steps for students. This one, it sort of is shocking to me, but we looked at what the next educational intent was by degree level and gender. And the fact of the matter that we had almost 80% of our female bachelor's students graduates that were applying to grad school compared to roughly 30% of the men. In this case, the pending category is indicative that either they are still waiting for a decision when they responded to the survey, or they have not actually selected. They may have multiple offers. And then the yellow are folks that basically all of their applications were rejected. So in both cases, for bachelor's and master's, we see more women indicating their intention to continue their education. That's flipped at the PhD level. A lot of the PhD, that data is representing folks that are then going on to, say, a professional school like an MBA program or law school. Some are indicating, a postdoc. We recognize we want to clarify the question a little bit more to address some of the folks that have slipped in that way. Job seeking resources. This is something we certainly talk to the students a lot about. The networking, the personal networking is absolutely critical. It shows up in this data. This is how everyone's pursuing it, particularly once you get to the PhD level. It is interesting because we asked the same question. It's in the report about seeking internships, and the internet was how most of the students wanted to go find find internships. But here, by the time they're hitting the actual job search, there's a recognition of the networking issue, and I think this is going to be a big question, as we have seen. We haven't been able to have in-person conferences until really this past year. There's still a propensity for folks to want to stay virtual or hybrid, but that certainly makes the networking process weaken. And will that have a future impact on students, either on their ability to find jobs or the way that they go about finding the jobs themselves? So, looking at employment status at graduation, this is actually almost dead on what we see from year to year. A little over 20% of our bachelors have a job coming out at graduation, slightly higher masters, and about half of the PhDs. The vast majority of the folks will have a job within 3 to 6 months. This is sort of normal across almost all degree fields, so there's nothing for us to really sweat about here. Next month's Heads and Chairs webinar, we'll have a deep dive into exactly those phenomenon. Leela will be discussing all that as part of the COVID's results and some of the longitudinal looks that we have at the labor force. So no big worries here. What I think is actually really interesting is that we pretty much have about 80% of our graduates have intention of staying in the profession, and I think that's a real strength. That our graduates want to continue in the geosciences even after their schooling. So I think kudos to all the departments. Clearly they've set folks up for success and for passion. Some of the students do get multiple job offers. In prior years, when we've had some really crazy stuff in the oil and gas industry, we saw some wild numbers here. Not too bad. So about a third of the third to 40% of the students have did get a job offer, got more than one. So this is actually pretty healthy. And again, I think this is reflective again what I hear from so many departments, that their best students right now are some of the best they've ever had, and so we do have a whole bunch of superstars floating around, and I think they're being recognized. So obviously the big one is the starting salaries. This is where we are seeing big changes. With the substantial decline in oil and gas hiring, the salaries across the board have shifted hard to the left here. We see some pretty low salaries now for bachelors relative. Some of this is because, in some of the professional services companies, as technicians, for instance, they are on hourly rates. And it's sort of a power by the hour kind of issue, so the students themselves may not be actually employed full time. And then we sort of see that shift, obviously, for the masters. Probably, I think, when you look across the U.S. economy, $40,000 to $60,000 range is pretty good. And the PhD sort of pick out the 50 to 60. We still have a few folks that are, sort of hitting the jackpot there. Because there are still folks getting into some of the resource, particularly in the raw materials area, with some pretty good offers. But this is a substantial shift from prior years, and it's mostly driven by oil and gas. So where did these students all go find employment? So professional services has been a big area. One of the things that we believe we're seeing are students that a lot of the oil and gas, mining, construction, waste management is actually probably in professional services companies, but they're reporting based on what their primary work task areas are. So this is something we're going to work harder to clarify with the students, make sure that we get ourselves a real firm basis. Because we have seen a shifting to the smaller companies across the board from almost all employers. With the larger employers not hiring geoscientists, but rather they will contract with a service provider who have the geoscientists on staff. The responses I've heard from employees is a lot of them like it because it's very diverse work. They may be working oil and gas and then construction and then an environmental or water problem. And so there's a lot of intellectual benefit if that's what they enjoy. The federal, state, and four-year colleges, those are mostly folks being employed as geotechs, in support of operations. The masters, we see, the raw material sector is booming, and it's been pretty strong. Oil and gas, which, it was only about 7 or 8 years ago, they were hiring about 70% of our masters, and it's down to 6%. They are not hiring, and the companies are coming back and say, we are not going to be hiring very many at all, geologists, geophysicists, even engineers. The nature of the business has changed. Will basically be subcontracting that work down to groups like professional service companies. So we are seeing a substantial shift about where the students, the new graduates, will end up actually landing, not necessarily in some of what we consider the traditional employers. They may remain traditional consumers of geoscience, but indirectly. The two things that I think are interesting about our masters, healthcare. We have seen this actually traditionally pop up at the master's level, usually masters in geophysics. The health imaging industry uses a lot of the same technologies, and they have been a consistent consumer of our master's geophysics graduates. We believe this is what's happening here. And the state hiring is really fascinating, and believe that what we saw was some level of attrition in the state ranks during the pandemic, but most states also had very flush budgets through the pandemic. That was sort of one of the big surprises, and it seems that there's been a lot of hiring of replacements across state agencies over the last year. So this was very positive for the master's community. And the doctorates in general, pretty much as you would expect, the research institutes, 4 years, universities and federal agencies, they're big consumers. The one that's big and different is the professional services. Historically, they have never wanted to hire doctoral graduates, but they did this year at a pretty good clip. And one of the things that I think we're seeing is the biggest complaint on the professional services groups is they need skillful employees coming out of school. We saw that increase in skillfulness of the doctorates, so we think there's a good chance that a lot of this is being driven by pretty good matches in what the employers are looking for and the what the students have and are ready to hit the ground running. So we also looked at professional credentials. This is a big area. This upper left one is just sort of the percentage of by degree level looking for professional credentials. We don't really get above a third. It's really a quarter to a third of the students say, hey, I'm graduating, I'm looking for professional credentials. And we ask which ones. Most are on licensure pathways. So a lot here, state licensing, and or doing fundamentals of geology, or focus on getting a GIT. A lot of these are obviously, you need to take the fundamentals to get your GIT, which then will lead to a state license. But again, capturing the various points where they're at. What's interesting is this whole master's spike on the fundamentals of geology exam. When you talk to ASBOG, they're like, no, you really want to take it when you're done with your bachelor's, not your master's. That fundamentals exam is better aligned to the breadth that someone's going to have coming out of a traditional geology program. So it's interesting to see sort of that shift. The one thing that we plan to add this upcoming year is related to drone licensing. We've seen this on applications for some of our scholarships, for instance, from master's students. The vast majority have a drones operating license at this point if they've been out working. So again, it's one of those kinds of credentials that seems to be coming into play to improve employment. So that's just a quick snapshot across a wide area. Happy to have a discussion about any of the data and your observations, because I think this is one of the key things. I'd like to hear what you're seeing out of your students and your situation, both as far as folks that are graduating, but also sort of the temperature that you're getting. We all are aware undergraduate enrollments are overall down. They're down less in geology or geoscience than they are across academia. But still there's this negative pressure, but we're also seeing schools that are either really hurting for students or really booming. And is there any are you seeing any kind of projections to basically maybe what your graduates are doing? Is there sort of a pathway here that is successful? So happy to take any questions anyone would have, and love to have a conversation.
Thanks, Chris. That was great. As I know, there are some questions in the chat, but if I could just ask you one question while others are probably thinking of their questions. You spent some time talking about professional services. Is there a reason why there were more in this, in that quadrant there? Are there more PhDs that are applying for jobs that they're really overqualified for, or are these contract services or these professional service companies are demanding more PhDs or having higher, needing higher qualifications? What do you think is the reason for that?
I think that's a great question. I think there's two things that are going on. I mean, the first, this data, this analysis is in the final report. We saw that professional services was actually one of the top areas that PhD graduates applied for jobs. This was a big change. And I think there's definitely a sentiment looking of great concern about sort of what the employment prospects are in academia right now. There's uncertainty, and obviously it's a very, very competitive area. And so the doctorate graduates seem to spread their search more broadly than we have seen in the past. But I think the other side is these service companies have made really clear they don't have the capacity for all the training. They need the graduates that are coming out that can do something, that they're skillful, and so I think they're looking at all of the skills that these doctorate graduates have as key assets. The independent research components, I mean, that's great, but actually you get so much on project management and all these other kinds of skills that come through doing a doctoral research project and everything, that it's a good package. I think they're recognizing the package, that they're not hiring someone that just wants to go off and study some very narrow area, but that they come with a really robust set of skills.
Thanks.
Chris, we got one question here from David talking back about the fields of degree slide that you showed.
Mm-hmm.
Is hydrogeology included in the geology percentages there, or is that a separate field that's called out in those questions?
Trying to remember. I think hydrogeology is actually baked into the geology component. When we only have the surface hydrology as a separate, which pops up in the upper levels.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. We do have another question here, kind of going back to the response rates for this.
Mm-hmm.
I know you talked about that briefly at the beginning, showing about 11% response rate for, I believe, all students.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about either historical data in terms of response rates, or how, what other data sets are you using to kind of combine with this set of data to get at more of those detailed conclusions that you were presenting today?
So I mean, we had just shy of 500 graduates respond to this survey this year, which is actually rather robust, selection. It was sent out to all the departments and also through the societies to try to canvas. So we're trying to reach out, through as many mechanisms to at least invite the entire, population that would be eligible. In general, most of the the data that's presented here is from that particular survey of those respondents. We do look at, we have this stuff historically, back, we've been doing this since about 2010, 2009, I think, and can look at some of those changes. We look at some of the federal data, and see some of the shifting there, some of the occupational categories, for instance, we're seeing those shifts at the aggregate level as well. So there's a lot of consistency that we're seeing, within these responses to the things that we're seeing, in the broader macroeconomic space of the geoscience. Some of the more internalized data about skills and experiences, it is what it is, and a lot of those, this is the first year, and it's complicated because of COVID. And so it's something that we want to start really analyzing longitudinally, and look also for better ways to capture it, and to also see if there are other avenues to get that feedback from graduates. In retrospect, there are some other societies like AAG and a few others that do conduct some of those kinds of analyses as well.
Great, thanks for that. Another question we have here in the chat, do you see the infrastructure bill having a positive impact on the geosciences? Are you picking any of that up in the survey data?
I actually expect it's going to have a very, very positive impact, and it's going to show up in those professional services companies. They're the ones that are nimble. These are the groups that we traditionally have called the environmental and engineering consulting firms. And they are bound to be well positioned to do it. The key thing is getting the appropriations through. The bill is authorized, and certain chunks of it are getting moved through, piece by piece. But I do expect this to be a real positive. It's going to be in this grab bag of these services companies, where the job opportunities are going to really expand. Some of it will be direct in the raw materials sector, particularly in aggregates and things like that. But just the critical minerals challenges, supply chain challenges that we're seeing as well are driving that space too. So we're in a bit of a different area or distribution of where the job strengths are than we were, say, even 5 or 10 years ago.
Great. It looks like David has a question here. So,
yeah, Chris, I saw your statistics on the employment sector from the state, which seemed pretty healthy. And as a administrator of a state agency, I can tell you, it seems like some of the money, perhaps infrastructure, a bit healthier. I know in my particular survey, we're going to have 3 positions we're searching for, but what we're finding, and I talked to some of my colleagues in other state agencies, is that our salaries are not competitive anymore, because after the great resignation and people started shuffling around jobs, they're expecting higher salaries, and of course state agencies are kind of held by rubrics of what the salaries they can allow, and so it's becoming difficult. We're having trouble hiring people because we can't offer competitive salaries.
Do you have any sense, David, where, when you're not laying, if you have any, shall we say, contested applicants, any sense where some of them may be going otherwise, that may have been looking at the survey, or do you find that the salaries are just so below that they're not entertaining it?
I'm not really sure. I know the federal government is hiring as well, and I think they're probably paying a little better, so people might be leaning that way. But it's hard to say. I mean, I had one somewhat, quite senior position, and it's been announced for 3 weeks, and I've had 1 applicant, and that just seems odd. So I'm not even sure where they're all going or what they're looking for. Maybe they're even changing, not looking in geology or whatever it might be, and are using that for something else, some different vocation. But it's not really clear. But I know, like I said, my colleagues in the state regulatory group are finding the same type of problem. They're just not getting applicants. I don't know why.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen the same kind of thing, even just like for internships, very, very low application rates, unfortunately, I think the the rhetoric we hear about the Great Resignation and people not applying for jobs it seems to be very, very real across all sectors, and it sounds like that's a challenge for the state surveys too.
Yes. Anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there for people that might be interesting, or I'm interested in if anybody else on the seminar is experiencing the same thing.
And Chris, we've got a question from Kyle here in the chat. Have you seen a trend in bachelor degree requirements for quantitative skills? Are we seeing that our program's starting to move towards requiring more or less math skills?
So I can only answer this anecdotally, talking with numbers of departments. I would say a few programs are continuing to reduce their quantitative requirements in hopes that will boost their number of students. But I would argue that in particularly the last 2 to 3 years, we are seeing I'll say it's a stiffening of resolve, that the students, they need to perform well across the core sciences and including the quantitative components. And this, and this is something we hear from the employers, that they express concern that if they hire a geology student and they don't have strength in their chemistry, their physics, biology, that's a negative impact, not to mention in the math. So certainly a number of the groups that we worked with through the Vision and Change program, we have seen a number of them at least double down that say you have to do, at least say through Calc 2 or what have you. I think the big thing as a community that we're really missing, there's a few schools that have tried to engage in this, is trying to address better means of teaching, particularly the quantitative skills in the geoscience context. We still have a preponderance in our programs where the students have to take those courses in their math departments, and that seems to be a really big barrier. Like I said, there's been movements both in biology and in physics with some success of math for physics, and it will cover calculus and differential equations and linear algebra but in an application kind of standpoint. And so I know a few groups have been exploring that, but it to me, it's ripe for a community-wide effort to try to design, in essence, I'll call it at least a universal strategy. And I think that would help a lot. That seems to be one of the barriers. I don't think it's the students are poor at math. I just don't think that they're getting the kind of math instruction they need.
Great, thanks for that. That's really helpful. So Pranoti, did you have any other questions, or Chris, anything else that you'd like to turn up?
I'd like, if anyone would be willing to share, what are your perceptions on the experiences of your recent graduates, or particularly some of your students that right now might be graduating at any of the levels, say coming up here in May, about what those experiences look like and their fears or their hopes or their opportunities. Arpita?
Thank you. I had a question, but before that, I could answer the question that you had. We are seeing a lot of success, at least, both in bachelor's and master's level. Once students are graduating recently, as soon as they graduate, or maybe within 3 months of their graduation, they are either getting employed or moving into the higher ed. So feeling good about the workforce or higher ed side once they graduate. My question was, I know in one of your graphs you showed that students knowing about geosciences is very limited in the community 2-year college space. Do you see any do you see that it would be worth tapping that resource to make is it an untapped resource? That is probably my question in the community college space, or folks had tried, but it didn't really work out.
Yeah, so no, it's a great question, and in the actual report, we have a whole analysis on the graduates who have gone through and some of their experiences in the community college, and whether they transferred directly from a formal program or took some classes, whether they took geo classes, and to be honest with you, there's been a lot of investment in tapping and engaging that community. I think we've really made some actual genuine progress. Just a couple years ago, we were at about 9% of our graduates that had taken a community college class. I think we're up around 19 or 20%, which is telling me that we are pulling in a new population. And so I think the investments, NSF has certainly invested a lot, and a lot of schools have looked at matriculation agreements, things like that. And those investments are paying off. It just takes a long time, and I hope the community is able to stick with them.
That's great. Would you be able to direct me to that document?
Sure. I'll look at the registration. I'll send you an email to a couple of my colleagues that have been very, very active in a number of those programs, and I'm sure they'd be happy to talk with you about what they're doing and some of the opportunities.
That's great. Thank you so much.
And Chris, we do have another question here in the chat. Can you talk about if you've seen anything in terms of employers looking for students with field or lab experience? I guess that would be more anecdotally, since we're querying against students in this survey rather than employers. But
well, I think your COVID. I mean, you'll see a deeper analysis of that in next month's when we look at the COVID study, because we do get into that. And I don't know if you want to make any comments, Leela, but certainly it seems my reading on that data, correct me if I'm wrong, is that there seems to be satisfaction with the level of laboratory and field experiences that folks have once they get into the workforce. Mm-hmm. And I can tell you from like our employer workshops, both for the Vision and Change and for the graduate education programs, the employers definitely value the benefits of those field experiences, of that real life context, and certainly the integrative learning that comes from it. I think the demand for specific field skills, for instance, is going to vary from group to group, but talking with folks that are in that professional services sector right now, if you have them, you're opening up more opportunities. The lacking any specific skills only closes doors, and so you suddenly become better positioned to get out there. I mean, it's like the OSHA requirements is usually about getting out in the field. Being allowed to go out in the field by an employer, and we have about 20-30% of the folks that are looking for credentials are looking for that. So the demand's there, and it does open the doors. But as an educational tool, I hear universal agreement that it can't be beat.
Yeah, and to steal the thunder a little bit from some of the stuff we'll cover next month, looking at the COVID surveys. Definitely top required skills from those surveys are showing that field skills and as well as proficiency with virtual platforms now, and that's a new one, but definitely field skills are top for what employers are looking for in new hires, actually requiring that new hires have. So very important.
Well, we don't have any other questions. I appreciate everyone's time. If you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out, email myself or email workforce@AmericanGeosciences.org. Happy to carry on the dialogue. Our intention is to be sending out a solicitation to the departments here in hopefully about 2 weeks for this year's survey. We would really appreciate all the help you can get to forward it on to your graduating students and anyone that's graduating in December, and encourage them, for the interest of the discipline to understand their experiences, to share what their experiences are through the survey. There's no penalty for anyone. It's to help all of us improve the geosciences.
Thanks, Chris. So If you have questions about the Heads and Chairs program that is run through AGU, I'd be happy to answer any questions for you. Please feel free to email me. If you'd like to join the Heads and Chairs community, you're welcome as well. And if we go to the last slide, we have an upcoming webinar next month, as was just mentioned, but you can certainly go to this link here and find other webinars you may have missed in the past. Thank you very much and have a great weekend, everybody.